Your app. Okay. You are sharing your app now. Okay. You are sharing PowerPoint, so this should be working. Okay. All right. So in the first class, I was basically trying to break down a standard grant application using the NIH application as an example of that you shouldn't just be thinking about, oh, I'm following the directions and I'm providing this information. You should be thinking about it in the sense of um, why is that information being requested and what is the projected target audience? And it's really easy when you're filling out forms for something to lose sight of that. And if you do lose sight of it, then you basically might not be answering the questions in the sense that they're meant, so that you are underestimating the time and effort you have to put in, or even not really understanding what you need to put into those particular areas. So, so the first class was about the main research plan. This class is basically about everything that is not the research plan. And I entitle this as Ignore the Rest of the Application at Your Peril. And the reason is that there is this extremely strong tendency from scientists to be so wrapped up in the research plan that they forget about the rest of the application. And depending on the mechanism, the rest of the application can make or break what you're applying to. So there are a lot of non-research plan components in grant applications. And these are essentially, you can have the best ideas in the world, but if you don't have access to the infrastructure that you need to do the work, it doesn't matter how great your ideas are, you can't actually do it. And that means the funding agency doesn't want to actually give you money. Now, some examples of those things are environment. If you have a wet lab project and you don't have access to a well kitted out wet lab, you can't do your work. Similarly, if you have this great clinical idea, but you don't have the patient population, you don't have the clinical resources to do the project, you can't do it either. So that environment, you really have to write it in such a way, not just as a characterization or a description of where you are, but always keep in mind that what the reviewer's asking is, do you have the infrastructure needed to carry out what you proposed in the research plan? So you have to make sure you include the things you really need for your work, but you might not need to put in every single thing for research at your institution. Now, biosketches are more about you. Is that, what is your track record of doing science? Do you have credentials that make it suggest you could actually do this work effectively? And this could be a variety of things. Do you have experience working with a particular tricky technique? Are you relatively senior in your career? Do you have a track record of, if you've gotten money in the past, do you have a track record of being able to finish a project and publishing it? Because there are a lot of scientists, to be perfectly honest, who have really, really great ideas, but they never seem to be able to follow through on it. So if you give them money, for this great idea, they never will be able to complete the work and never be able to get it published. So when they're looking at biosketches, they're looking at your ability to finish things. Of course, things like budget and justification. Did you ask for enough money to do the work? Or is it clear that you understand how much it will cost to do the work at the highest level possible? And this is a case that too much budget, asking for too much money or too little money can be equally bad here. Because if you're proposing to do something that cannot be done for the amount of money you're asking for, that's showing you're naive and it's showing that you're not able to get the work done. If you ask for too much money, that's padding budgets and whatnot. Another thing that I don't have as a bullet point here could be mentoring plans. So that if you're an MRDA investigator, a mentoring plan had to be filled out and turned in for your application. That's also part of completing the work. Presumably, you're getting an early career training grant of some sort because you need mentoring and education on how to do the project. If there's not a good plan for letting you get that experience, then you're essentially not going to be able to get the work done. So a good mentoring plan can be really, really critical. And for training applications, it can be actually reviewed more critically than the research plan itself. And then there's also like the research compliance stuff, and that could be animal subjects, human subjects, biosafety, research data sharing plans, even something as simple as a tax ID number. And those things are critical because if every single box there isn't checked, the agency can't give you money. It could be that you have a great idea, you have great ideas to do the work, everything else is in place, but if you fail on research compliance, they can't give you money. And just as an example for the upcoming Embry pilot grants, if you have a research compliance thing that you have to worry about, let's say an animal subject or a human subject approval, if that isn't in place on the day you get the notification that they want to fund you, they can't, because of timing issues, that you can't get the grant. Doesn't matter how well everything else came out, that the time will be very, very short after you figure out whether you get the award or not. If you don't have your human subjects approvals done, the Embry can't fund you. And I'm just telling you this as somebody who's been at the meetings about the Embry pilot grants. There's a logistical reason for that. So they can't wait for you to take weeks or months to get your human subjects approval. If it's not approved on the day that you get the award announcement, you just lost that grant. So you have to pay attention to it. Okay? So are people kind of clear on that? Okay, here we go. Now, another thing that people, when they write grants, often use the strategy to writing all of their non-research plan components. They strategize it almost completely backwards. There's this very, very strong tendency, again, to be so wrapped up in developing the research plan components that you kind of have this tendency to leave what people consider the bureaucratic forms for last. However, those are almost the things you should be working on first and not last. And ideally, you want to start out a month or two. Especially if you have never submitted a grant before, it is not a mistake to start working on those components a couple months out. And the reason is that you don't have a lot of information already written, you don't have stuff saved, and it can take significant amounts of time to get the information you need to fill out what those components are. So some reasons that, starting on all of the form pages early is important. Some of it depends on where you're working. Now, a big one, and is particularly for CTR and Embry institutions, that if you work at an institution that does not have a strong history of grant support, or you're writing a grant that's a collaboration, and things to think about that could be a small college, that could be a community health center, that could be like a church outreach group or something like that. They might not have the paperwork in place. They might not have the number to give you to show that they've already filed all of the pieces of paperwork necessary for the government to give money to them. And if those pieces aren't in place, it could take months to get these in place. I mean, just like really simple things like federal tax ID numbers and research compliance numbers and stuff. Those forms need to be filled out. They undergo a federal bureaucracy, and you might not be able to submit because the community health center doesn't have the compliance paperwork in place. And you just and like if you're, like the University of Delaware, we have all these numbers for the most part, but there's a lot of environments where, applying for grants isn't on their radar screen. So you have to find out what's needed, and it might not be easy to get. Another thing is, and in a similar light, even if you're at a major big research institution that has millions and millions of dollars in grants, maybe you're going to be collaborating with somebody who doesn't apply for grants regularly. Let's say you're doing community engaged research and you are if you are doing some kind of a project in a church organization that's involved in, I'll pick prostate cancer screening because I know people who work with organizations like that in Delaware. They might be doing really, really great outreach that you want to collaborate with them with. But if they, have never had to put together, like the director of that has not applied for an NIH grant, they might not have an NIH-style Biosketch. They may not have an ERA Commons ID. They might not have all of the sort of standard documents that are used to show that somebody is qualified to collaborate. And if somebody's busy, it's even worse to try to get all those documents into a compliant format. Like, just as an example, I have a collaboration with a vitreoretinal surgeon in Ohio. He is a world-class vitreoretinal surgeon. But all of his funding, for the most part, for his research comes from industry contracts. He is probably one of the most overcommitted human beings I know, and he didn't have an NIH Biosketch when we were trying to submit an NIH grant together. And just getting him to take the time necessary to build that document of unfamiliar format, it got to the point that I ended up having to write his Biosketch for him. Simply because he didn't have the time to figure out how to do one effectively. So you have to keep that in mind. Your collaborators may not just have one of these sitting around. Like if you ask me for an NIH Biosketch, I could almost turn it around to you in under a half hour because I have one that I just have to fiddle with. That's not true for many, many folks. Similarly, especially if you're applying to NIH, there's a requirement for these ERA Commons IDs. So if you are submitting Biosketches for collaborators in support of your work, that one of the pieces of the Biosketch is an ERA Commons ID. And they can't apply for that. It has to be applied for through an actual, through a research office of an organization. And different research offices have different workflows, different abilities to turn this around quickly. And if your collaborator's at an institution that doesn't have that process just streamlined, it can take a long time to get an ERA Commons ID, which means you don't have a compliant Biosketch. That I already mentioned about IACUC, which is Animal Subjects Approval, or IRB, Institutional Review Board Approval. These are seldom quick. You can't get an IRB approval in 24 hours, even if maybe even especially if you're at a research-intensive institution. And like I mentioned, for instance, with the Embry pilot grants, you might be able to submit that grant without having your IRB approved. You will not get it funded if the IRB approval does not happen very, very quickly. There are other types of grants that you have to have the project IRB approved when you apply. So you have to work on that 2-3 months out to make sure you have all your approvals before you even apply. And then finally, another one is that before you can submit a grant, you have to get your research office or your research compliance office to sign off. Now, many of these offices are perfectly happy to go through all your paperwork pages, make sure you've done it all, make sure you have filled them out correctly. We'll even look at them and proof them. But grant deadlines are for everybody. So just as an example, the grant deadlines for NIH R1s are always on the same dates. They're the 5th of the month on the 3 months where there's deadlines. And if you're at an institution, there could be anywhere between 5 and 20 people all submitting grants for that same deadline. and those are administered by the exact same compliance officers in the main office. If you're giving them if they're seeing some of your other paperwork a day or two before that grant's due, they just simply do not have time to look at it for you. And if those pieces of paperwork go in wrong, your grant might not even get reviewed because it wasn't a compliant application. On the other side, though, is that you can start sending that stuff into those research officers a month out, 6 weeks out. And usually, like, they go through these waves of busy. Sometimes they are enormously busy, and other times they're not really that busy at all. If you can get all that paperwork to them when they're not that busy, they'll be perfectly happy to go through it. Make sure it's in good shape. I do this with our research office at the University of Delaware almost always I try to get compliance paperwork in early. And they have found so many mistakes or things that I omitted or things that I didn't say right. And they had the time to give us feedback because it got into their hands early enough. But probably the most important part of this is that when you're writing a grant, a human nature sort of thing is that you want to focus on the research plan. And that you're sending it to people, you're getting feedback, you're incorporating that feedback. And most of the time, people want to keep re-editing and keep refining, making sure there's no typos, really right up to that deadline. And if you still have to spend a day or two with all of the other paperwork 3 days before your grant's due, you won't have the time to do that final check for typos in your grant application because you're going to be trying to write, very fast first drafts of all the other pages. So it's a human nature thing. Now, that one thing is that I would also say to you is that when you're trying to write a research plan, that there are times where you're just too brain dead. You can't think of another, you just can't read another paper. You can't, work on the main grant anymore. When you're just tired, that's the time to write your first drafts of your environment pages and write the first drafts of your budget justification and so forth. Because it really doesn't take the same level of intellectual commitment and effort to write those things as it takes to write the rest of your grant. So it also helps maximize your working time, is that, you work really hard, you read a lot of literature, trying to formulate that aim, and then it's like, oh, I'm tired for the day. That is when you should be working on all of your ancillary forms and stuff. Now, one thing, though, that no matter where you work, departmental or institutional grants administrators, those are those people who make sure everything's in compliance. They help you with all of the paperwork. They are the ones that sign off the permission for you to write the grant. They really would appreciate almost always a heads up that you're going to submit. Some of that is so that they can just plan their workflow. That some of it is that if it's a weird grant that has guidelines that you're not familiar with, if you give them a couple months heads up, they actually have time to read the 50-page application directions for the grant and can figure out everything you need. And sometimes it can be weird stuff. Like I am currently working on a grant application that requires me to submit with my grant application the tax returns for the University of Delaware. Now, it seems really, really weird, but I've actually had foundations request have full tax returns, and it's because they work with a lot of agencies, and they require that to certify your institution's nonprofit status. Well, very often, trying to even find the right person that has the tax return of your organization is tough, and being able to dig that out. So you just need the time for the grants administrators to help you find who actually has your nonprofit tax return for your institution. That in and of itself can take a lot of time. And this allows you and your departmental grants administrator to be clear on exactly what information you need. That it allows that workload planning, as I said. Also, the thing to keep in mind is that almost always grants are not made to you. There's a small number of exceptions, but you feel like it's your grant. You've written it, you've proposed it, you're going to do the work. But legally, grants are almost never yours. They're not made to you. They're made to your institution. So that it's not you that has the buck stops here, legal responsibility for that grant or award. It's your institution. So the institutions want to make sure they are not basically filing a grant application, in other words, almost the legal commitment to do something they're unable to do. So they are essentially, since they're the ones that have to legally submit your application instead of you, you have to give them time to make sure that the institution agrees. Usually that's a rubber stamp, but you can imagine times when they might not want to rubber stamp that. Maybe you are developing a new method for processing medical grade cannabis. Your institution may or may not want to have that kind of research going on in their institution. And if that's the case, that they have to set that up the line through the administrators to make sure that they're open to having that kind of research being done. So there's a lot of reasons to, work stuff out ahead of time. So are there any questions up to now? We good? Okay. All right. So some recommendations that I give to people is that 2 months out from your application being due, if all possible, you want to work with your research office and your institutional grants administrator, and you want to compile a list of all information needed. And that will require close reading of the grant application guidelines. Now, how hard that'll be will depend. Sometimes the grant application guidelines will be a paragraph, and other times they'll be like 150 pages, like the NIH rules for grant applications. Once you've compiled a list of what's needed, you should look at that list and see which things might be hard. Like, are you sure that that community organization has certain federal compliance issues? Does your major collaborator there have an ERA Commons ID and a Biosketch? That do you have, that do you need their your institution's tax return, and how are you going to figure out how to get that? Now, I usually recommend that by 1 month out, you should have all components of the non-research plan drafted, if at all possible. Now, some of this is one of the things that I didn't mention is requests for reagents and collaborations. It could be that you've asked your friend to give you a mouse or to give you a data set, but that's different. Them saying yes over beer at a conference is different from getting an actual formal letter that explains what they're giving you under what terms. And you're going to need that letter signed by them to include in the application. You have to give your collaborators, they're busy too. You have to give them time to be able to turn around requests for formal letters of collaboration or reagents. That you should have tried to complete all necessary biosketches. And that's again part of this whole process, that you want to be a chance to read them, to make sure they're all in the right format. NIH biosketches have to be written to the project. So you don't want to send in a biosketch to mentor somebody for your, like, let's say you're turning in biosketches written by your mentors. You want that biosketch to be customized for your project and the mentoring plan, not be the biosketch that says they are the world's God's gift to research, that has nothing to do with them, their ability to be your mentors. By having the first drafts done a month out, you have the time to make sure that everything fits into the scope of your project. And personally, I would tell you that all non-research plan components, you should have them pretty much completely done, and so that your research office is able to check them for compliance. Because if all that's done, then all you have to do is focus on fine-tuning and having your research plan edited, which will make your life way less crazy. All right. Now, to talk a little bit about some common pieces of grant applications. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about them using NIH-type terms, but these are common components of grant applications to any organization that you might be attending. And the first one is very important, is environment pages. Now, environment pages are really critical so that the reviewers know that the extent and quality of your research space and the research environment are going to support your project. The reviewers, one of the things they look at is not just, is this a good project and should it be done, is where you're located, an environment that will allow this work to actually occur. They also, this is where they're looking at institutional backing. I mean, if you are at a Research One institution that's well known and you're a full professor, environment pages, reviewers often don't look very closely at them because you're at an environment with a reputation to do the work. That you are somebody who has been able to do this kind of work in that environment in the past. They're not going to closely read those environment pages. However, if you are a young investigator, the environment pages will often be checked very closely. That do you have your own lab space, or are you sharing lab space? Do you have a institutionally provided startup package? How much equipment do you have available to you? Do you have the resources as an individual investigator to actually get this work done? As a new investigator, you want to make sure your environment pages make it really, really clear that the institution is behind you and is supporting your work because they have given you the resources necessary to do this work. One place about environment pages is that, you may borrow somebody's grant. Maybe it's your postdoc mentor, your clinical fellow mentor. You read their grant, and you're going to sometimes see that their environment pages are very kind of bare bones. They don't give a lot of detail or information. And you'll think, oh, I'm going to write my environmental pages similarly. However, you have to be very careful about that because, being perfectly honest, if you are a faculty member at Harvard Medical School, there's many things that, because of the nature of your organization, the reviewers are just going to take as a given. Of course, it's a strong clinical environment. Of course, they have all of the basic stuff to get research done. However, if you're at an institution that might not be familiar to the reviewer, and to be honest, that's often a CTR and IMBRI member institution, they don't know what you have related to infrastructure. I mean, even like in my case, I work at the University of Delaware. In my field, for the first 15 years I worked here, there was not a single person in the entire state of Delaware who was funded to do eye research, okay? Nobody in my field knew anything about the University of Delaware's ability to support research or not. So that meant that I was not going to get the benefit of the doubt that I had everything in place to do my research. So I had to write very, very clear and specific environment pages showing that we have everything we need to do my work. So this is something that, don't be lulled into a false sense that environment pages should be kind of bare bones by reading, like let's say you did your fellowship at Penn. You can't really take your mentor's grant environment pages and say, oh, I'm going to be able to get away with that. Because people might not know what the clinical environment is at Christiana or Nemours or BB. They might not know, what kind of equipment is available at Del State or even University of Delaware. So you do need to really sell that your environment is adequate to do your work. Um, you also, though, want to sell that your proposed work can be done in your environment. So this can be everything from the composition of your department, like what kind of faculty colleagues do you have that do similar kind of work that can help you with this if you run into a problem? What equipment do you have relevant to your work? Now, this is a case that should probably only focus on the equivalent relevant to your work. So if you are doing a project that's heavy in morphological imaging, you don't need to give a detailed description of the bioinformatic facilities or the mass spec facilities because they're not relevant to you doing your work. For those of you in clinical environments, you really are going to want to talk about, like at Nemours, people might not know what a huge amount of clinical, like the thousands and thousands of patients seen. They might not know, that these patients tend to cluster in certain environments. They might not know that Nemours does stuff that's very, very important in obesity research. So you have to tell them that this is this robust clinical environment that I can do clinical research in. Now, one thing as you do environment pages, you probably can get some kind of a canned boilerplate. You do have colleagues. We're all at institutions that submit research grants. And certainly as a starting point, you can ask for the environment pages for somebody at your institution. Like, for instance, I share my environment pages to other people in my department. But please, please, please edit that canned boilerplate. Customize it to your project. It doesn't make any, because otherwise it'll be very, very clear that you copied it from somebody else. And like I said, don't include resources that aren't relevant to your research plan. Okay. Now, so is everybody kind of okay on environment pages and kind of had to think about them? And, please, write very detailed, elaborate ones. Don't just shoot in a bedboard one. What you want to shoot for is environment doesn't really drive your score, but if they don't think your environment's good, it doesn't necessarily add to points, but it can definitely chop off points of your grant. So if you write a good environment page, then you'll get a 1 or a 2 in environment from NIH. That's a very, very good score. And environment won't be the subject of what you're going to be reviewed on. Is everybody good on that? Okay. So next is biosketches. Biosketch formats have changed drastically over the past 10 years. And that you can have somebody who has an NIH-style biosketch, for instance, but they haven't submitted a grant recently. The format will not be correct. Now, for this group, NIH-style biosketches are the most common. But keep in mind, NSF has a completely different biosketch style that focuses on different things. And sometimes specific grant agencies also have yet other biosketch styles. So it's really, really important to comply with biosketch formats. That sometimes you can get away with it, a non-compliant biosketch, but I know of people who have submitted NIH grants with non-compliant biosketches, and they were returned to them without review. It sort of depends on who's doing the audits, but NIH, particularly if everything isn't in the right format, all the way down to font, it can be not reviewed. I actually know of a grant at the University of Delaware that they used for whatever reason, they ended up with too many lines per page on their biosketch based on the guidelines, and it was just returned to the person who submitted it without review. Okay, so, compliance is really important. If you've never written an NIH-style biosketch, this is not something to leave to the last minute. There's a section that's called Contributions to Science. You need to really develop that in a thoughtful way. It's really a case where you're telling the reviewer, this is all the great stuff I've done in my career to date. a lot of people do these badly because scientists kind of intrinsically aren't good at marketing themselves, or, as I say here, tooting their own horn. That you really want to write these as marketing documents to your abilities and accomplishments. It's not like an academic CV where you just write stuff that's like facts. You basically talk about your impact. Now, most of you are early career scientists. You might have done stuff that's important and accomplished stuff research-wise, but you haven't published it. These contributions to science sections on biosketches are completely fine with that. So if you wrote an important project manual, you wrote a standard operating procedure, you had a GenBank accession, that you can talk about, like a project you might have done as a clinical fellow that didn't lead to something that was published, but maybe it led to a change in like a departmental procedure related to clinical care. That's still a contribution to science, even though it's not published. However, if you're more established and you have a lot of publications, definitely focus on things that have peer-reviewed contributions. But like I said, if you're early career, still put the stuff you've done that might not have been published in the peer-reviewed literature.
Dr. Duncan?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, this is Lindsay. I had a quick question for you.
No problem.
Is it worth including like a peer-reviewed publication if it has nothing to do with the topic that you're writing your grant on?
Absolutely, it does. I would definitely include it. So that, especially if you're early career, this speaks to your kind of overall ability. So if you are, you did, like, I'll just use an example for the PhD world, is that maybe you did an undergraduate research project on, I don't know, snail lipid metabolism. And you did a PhD project studying the genetics of infertility. And then, you did your postdoc on, I'll use eyes. That if you don't have a lot of independent contributions yet on your eye research, which is what your grant's on, you should absolutely talk about the paper you got as an undergrad on lipids in snails and the stuff you did as a graduate student on genetics of infertility. It might drop off your Biosketch later in life, but if those are your major things you've done, you want to include them because it's speaking to your ability to be productive over years. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And those examples are actually from my own career. So, I don't have any of my snail lipid work on my Biosketch, or I don't even put my publications from that work on my Biosketch anymore because nobody cares. I did it 30 years ago, right? But if I was like a brand new assistant professor, I would have absolutely had that on because it shows that I've been productive for a long period of time. Okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Now, another thing is that when you're getting biosketches from collaborators or mentors, you can't just get the biosketch from somebody and upload it. It's really, really important that you make sure that those biosketches contribute to a holistic whole related to the project. One is making sure that they also actually comply with the format. So if you're working with people who don't routinely deal with NIH grants, you can get some biosketches that basically don't comply with format. And you have to work with that person to get it into the right format. There's also, you want to make sure they're customized for the project. So that, you have somebody who wrote a biosketch for their last grant submission, and now you've asked them to collaborate. The beginning paragraph of that biosketch should have been rewritten so that it's explaining why this person is an important collaborator on the project, not explaining why they're the well-qualified person to do the project that their last grant submission was. By rewrite, and that's like a really big red flag when that intro paragraph doesn't match what the application's about. Those of you who are getting mentors for things, that first paragraph should talk about whether that person's qualified to be your mentor. It shouldn't be talking about why that person is necessarily God's gift to science. And I would absolutely make sure that you do this really far ahead. Traditionally, this is a place where pilot grants and MRDA applications fall down, is that the submitted biosketch of the mentors and collaborators are not customized to the application being submitted. Okay. Okay, so just a few things that are kind of best practices that might not be clear in the directions to the biosketch is that when you get to the contributions to science section of the biosketch, before you even start launching into your commentary, I would highly recommend that you list your total number of publications. So when you say contributions to science, your contributions to science, you might say, I have currently published 15 publications in the literature. That you might not show all 15 papers as you talk about your contributions, but this is pointing to, again, this long-term productivity. That even if you're very, very senior in the field, it's good to say that because, people don't know everybody. And it could be that there's a study section member who doesn't know that you have the one who developed that field. By pointing out, your contributions is good. The other thing that is kind of underemphasized in the directions to biosketches is that you have the opportunity to not just talk about your contributions of science. You also have the opportunity to include every single publication you ever have had on your biosketch. And you can't list them on your biosketch because it's not a CV, but you can create what's called My Bibliography. So the National Library of Medicine site under My NCBI, you can create a document called My Bibliography, which basically has a curated list of every single publication you've ever published with links to the PubMed links to them. That personally, I'll look at somebody's contributions to science, but I also almost always click on a My Bibliography link on a biosketch because that's, biosketches are marketing documents. Push comes to shove, the reviewer is going to care about your overarching productivity. You can sell that if you like, but they also want to see how many first author papers you have, how many last author papers you have, how productive are you overall. And this is what the reviewer checks to make sure that what you're claiming as productivity and your contributions to science actually reflects how many pubs you have. Now, this is something that I would give you lead time for if you have informed by bibliography. It can be a little bit clunky to do, particularly if you have a decent number of publications. Now, one thing that is a general rule of thumb, now it used to be the rules are never place in preparation or submitted manuscripts on your biosketch. However, NIH just changed their policy a year or two ago, allowing you to put what they called intermediate research products on your biosketch. And this is if you decide to turn your document into like you write a draft paper and you submit it to BioRIV, which is a kind of a place where you can upload preprints of publications. You can now put that on your biosketch. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. All right. So now one thing at the very, very end of a biosketch is the research support section. This is where the reviewer's looking at how much money you have. That for many of you, you're new investigators. If you have gotten startup funds or any other kind of financial institutional support like a dedicated lab space, a certain amount of money to do your project to start with, it can be good to include that there. It's not an external grant, but by pointing out that your institution has made a financial commitment to your research, that can strengthen the your application in that the reviewer knows your institution has made a significant commitment to you. That definitely you want to list any of your current funding or any that you know you will get. So you have not gotten the award letter, but they told you they're going to fund you. It's actually, unless you have 5 R01 grants, showing that you have current funding actually helps your case. It doesn't hurt your case. Now, generally, it says that you're obligated to include all funding that is either active or has expired within the past 3 years. However, in some cases, you can include older grants. Let's say you're a clinician and you've been in a highly clinically intensive job for the past couple years, that you can include some of your older awards to show that you do have a track record here. Okay? Is everybody good on biosketches? Okay. All right. All right. So budget justifications. This is what this looks like is going to depend on exactly the kind of grant that you're applying for. It's overall just the listing of how much money you're asking for, along with why you need it. Depending, what this looks like is going to highly depend on the kind of grant you apply for. So NIH applications from the justification side require you to justify staff and their duties or percent effort. However, there are flavors of NIH grant awards where that all your budgets are in $25,000 increments, all the way up to $250,000. Under that case, you don't have to ask for detailed justifications of every single pipette tip you're going to buy. They just want kind of an overarching saying why you need the amount of money you're asking. However, NIH also has non-modular grants, and there are also pretty much almost every other grant mechanism. You're going to ask for money, and you have to explicitly justify stuff. Like you might be justifying that I need $1,000 in gloves, and I need, this much money for clinical coordinator or whatever. Your budgets and your budget justifications are often the part of a grant that is most highly scrutinized by the institutional grants officers, because they want to make sure that what's going in, you're asking for everything you can be asking. And there's also different rules about indirect costs. In other words, the money the institution gets out of your grant, that they want to make sure you're asking for all the indirect costs you can ask for, and that everything you're asking for indirect costs actually fulfills the rules. For instance, if you're asking for a very, very large piece of equipment, there's no indirect costs associated with that. So they want to make sure you did all those calculations correctly. Now, some things to keep in mind is that, especially for the NIH, there are certain NIH grants that are always the same amount of money. Like an R15, there's a set amount of money for an R15. There's a set amount of money for some of the K awards and a few of the R awards. But usually that's not the case. And whether it's the smallest foundation asking for a $2,000 grant or the largest NIH award that might be asking for millions, reviewers are always asked, about how to cut money, or grants officers want to fund the maximum number of people as possible, so they will often cut money from grants. And particularly if you're asking for what the reviewers consider too much money, that the reviewers will be like, you don't need that much money to do that work. They will cut it. That said, it's also really, really important to not ask for too little money. Sometimes, especially new applicants, will get this in their head saying, oh, If I ask for $125,000 instead of $200,000, they're more likely to give me the grant because I am not asking for as much money. But that's not how it works. Actually, lowballing your budget can seriously backfire. If the reviewer reads your grant and you ask for $125,000 and they know it'll cost $250,000, it's like you're too naive. You don't know, what things cost, and they might knock down your score simply because you actually can't do the project for the amount of money you asked for. So and reviewers, I have been reviewed grants where the reviewers will say, this is a great project, but they can't do it for that amount of money. Can we recommend in the budget that they get funded for $50,000 more than they initially asked for? And no, in fact, you can't. That a reviewer can recommend reductions in budget, but NIH won't let a reviewer recommend increases in budget. So if you lowball your budget, you're in the worst of all worlds. You want to have a realistic, reasonable budget, but it'll backfire to you if you basically request a small budget for a large scope grant. Okay. So any questions about budget sorts of things? Budgets are definitely something I would recommend that you get done early, particularly if you're asking for odd things, because sometimes buried in the institutional agreements with the federal government are these weird provisos about what you can ask for and what you can't. Like at the University of Delaware, you can't actually ask for office supplies as part of your grant budget because supposedly the university is supposed to provide that. Similarly, like there's certain things like if you need time on a ship, the budgets for that are very, very different by federal rules than if you need to rent a car. And it's just things you may not know, but the institutional grants people might know. Okay. All right. So human subjects. So the people who are on this call, the majority seem to be doing human subjects research. And this is a case where you can have a wonderful application. And if you don't do the human subject sections correctly, you won't get funded. The grant review committees read human subject sections really carefully. They're looking for the evidence that you fully considered the challenges of getting a sufficient number of patients that are willing to consent. They're going to want to see very, very closely that you have looked at power analysis and whether you're going to be studying enough people to get statistically relevant data. That in your human subject sections, you have to be very specific about whether you have appropriate racial, age, and gender diversity, and that if you don't, you want to fully justify why your study subjects don't represent the full diversity of the population. And I would tell you, you can't be too obvious here. There are very strict rules now about including research subjects across the lifespan. There are very specific rules about getting people with appropriate population, ethnic, and racial diversity. There's also clear rules about including women and men at appropriate numbers. If you're studying prostate cancer, actually state why you're not including women. If you're studying Alzheimer's disease, absolutely state why you're not including children in your study population. That while it seems obvious to you, you could easily get a reviewer who will flag your work because of just a misunderstanding. That under a different context, I used to study a disease called premature ovarian failure. And I had a reviewer come back to me and complain that I wasn't including men in my study. And it's like, isn't it obvious that men don't have ovaries? But it seems like it's bloody obvious, but the reviewer wasn't thinking at that point. They were just looking to check a box. And I actually needed to say that no, actually, men don't have ovaries. And it seems obvious, but I really did need to justify it. I already mentioned about sample sizes being fully justified biostatistically. Now, another thing is that if your human subjects research falls under exempt categories or not human categories, you still have to include the justification for this, because the reviewers are asked to review human subject sessions, but they're often not that familiar with the ins and outs of what makes human subjects research exempt and when is research on human cells not considered human research. So if you have your exemption letter from your IRB or even the non-humans determination from your IRB, you should specifically state that this research, although using human cells, it has been designated not human under this particular reason. If your research is considered exempt human subjects research, you should give the exemption and the information from that exemption letter you got from your IRB. And it's just, you don't want your grant flagged for secondary processing by a reviewer who's not familiar with the rules for human subjects research. Okay. I'm not going to spend as much time on animal subjects because I don't think too many people on the call do animals. But just a few things is, again, detailed descriptions. You want to include species, strains, ages. Animal subjects, again, NIH is now all about being concerned with making sure that gender diversity is included in research protocols. You can't just pick just doing a study on males or just a study on females for convenience. That saying that, oh, you don't want to use females because they have an estrous cycle and it'll induce variance in my data. That's actually a reason that you have to include females in your studies. And NIH is really serious about that. If you are inappropriately limiting gender of your research subjects, they will flag you and not fund you. You have to justify why you're using animals. You also have to show that you're minimizing pain and distress, that you want to be pretty specific here, especially if you're doing something like related to surgeries or that related to fear or something like that. You really want to explain that you're minimizing the animal's discomfort. Okay. Now, one of the thing that I have to say, and this is a huge, huge thing to be concerned about, like environment pages, people often reuse their animal and human subjects justifications. They, leave these things for the last minute and they just like, oh, I can just reuse this one that I submitted in my last grant. And they never actually reread them and make sure that the animal and human subjects pages are properly customized for their project. I have seen over the years many, many applications that clearly, were waiting to the last minute to submit. It's like, oh, yeah, I need an animal subjects section. I'll just take it from this grant. And they'll have the wrong mutant animals listed. They'll have the wrong procedures listed. And it's just sloppiness. It'll cause your grant to be will be flagged. And if NIH program is reviewing your animal subjects section, it is way harder to get that approved than if your reviewers just say it's fine. So this is another take home. Don't wait to do animal and human subjects last. Do it very early in your grant writing process to make sure you have had a chance to proof those things, to make sure that those forms actually match the project that you have applied for. Now, this is a case that, get it done ahead of time, but then definitely give it another read like a week before you submit. Because maybe you added another animal mutant. Maybe you changed the human research a little bit. as you have edited your grant. You just want to make sure the entire application is internally consistent with each other. All right. All right, so is everybody okay with the actual pieces that go in the grant itself? Now, the next thing I want to talk about is just-in-time information. And just-in-time information, particularly those of you who are on this call who might be planning to submit a IMBRI pilot grant or a CTR pilot grant. Just-in-time information is information that the funding agency needs to give you money, but that they're not asking you for when you apply. So just some very clear examples of just-in-time information are information on whether your work is approved by an institutional review board or an IACUC. So you're not obligated to have gone through all of the pain and process of getting your IRB approved when you apply, but they're not going to give you a penny of money unless your IRB and your IACUCs are approved. So those of you who might be considering applying for those sorts of applications, all right, you might not have your IRB approved today, but as soon as you get your grant in, you should have that IRB application done, submitted, and you should be working with the IRB to make it in a form that it can be approved. Because like I mentioned, because of the time frame of how the IMBRI pilot funding is going to be, that if the reviews are going to be done of the grants, the first cut of who's going to get recommended for award will be made. But the time frame between that announcement and that they will very, very quickly need all of these just-in-time informations. There's going to be no time for delay. You're going to need to have IRB and IACUC approval in hand at the time, or you're not going to get funded. Okay. That there's also a section called Other Support and Pending Applications. This is a final audit that NIH and many other granting agencies do right before they give you your money. This comes from that you're not allowed to double dip. So you might be able to submit the same project, let's say, to NIH and a foundation and maybe the Department of Defense, doing pretty much the same project, but you're not allowed to accept grants from those three places that are proposing to do the same work simultaneously. So you can't get twice the money for what you propose to do. So this Other Support and Pending Applications document basically is an audit NIH does to make sure you're not double dipping funds. Now, if you are, if this is just for the NIH from a regular process, that if your grant scores in the top 30% of applications, like right after the study section meets, just-in-time will pop up. But that doesn't mean you actually need to submit it. Usually a little bit closer to the time of the grant start, they'll contact you specifically saying, yeah, you need to do the just-in-time, because even though they'll ask for it if you scored in the top 30% of grants, that doesn't mean, but they might only be funding the top 15% of grants. So if you got a 29th percentile on an NIH grant submission, you probably don't need to be filling out just-in-time because you're not going to get the grant. So that's a question you can ask your program officer about. Now, something that I just came across is that just-in-time has another level of audit that is something that's only recently been initiated. And this is that they will look at every single person who's listed on your project. They will look at you. They will look at, let's say, your lab manager. They will look at the grad student on the project, the clinical fellow on the project. And they compare that list of staff on the project with something called a debarment list. So what debarment means is that there is you have had some violation of ethics or finances or something with the government which basically bars you from receiving benefit from federal grant funds. And that they only pretty much check by name. And what it can mean is that if a name match happens on a debarment audit, it could just be it's somebody with a name similar to somebody on the debarment list. It could be, so what can happen is that they will hold up your grant funding because of a name match. And you have to basically try to figure out whether or not the person who's working on your project is in fact the same person on the name badge. And unfortunately, they're not giving you a lot of information on who the person on the debarment list is. So this is just a case where you have to be organized, you have to be on top of things. It's tedious and it's annoying, but every day you delays when they're able to write you an award letter. And if it delays too much, you might not get the award at all, because NIH has money in fiscal years. And like I ran into a thing where I had a grant that was being considered for funding in September. If my grant got caught up too much in all this regulatory processing, if it wasn't completed by September 31st, I wouldn't get the grant because they didn't have the money to fund me for the next fiscal year. They only had it within that fiscal year. So again, be on top of these things at the funding level. Okay. Just a few other things that you're going to get, that you're going to have to write. You have to write resource and data sharing plans. So if you have resources for the scientific community, you've made constructs, you've made genetically modified animals, you've created databases. You're obligated, if you receive federal funding, to give them to people in the scientific community. And you have to write a written plan of how you will share that data. Your institution probably has a boilerplate about legal aspects of data and sharing and resource transfer, but NIH insists upon it, and anytime you have a large data set, you have to explain how you're going to make the decision of when to share it and when not to share it. And then finally, there's the biosafety session. That if you're working at biosafety 2 or above, you're using certain viruses, you have certain human clinical material, which is you're collecting blood and doing assays on. You want to talk about how you're handling it stuff with universal precautions and all of this stuff in the biosafety section. And that's something that the people often omit because they're like, oh, I'm not studying Ebola. That's not actually what they mean. They mean biosafety at all levels. Okay. So those are some examples of things. Things like mentoring plans and this sort of thing are also often included. So let me see if I can get out of this. So with that, I can kind of open it up for more questions if people have that. Okay. So
I actually had a question.
Sure, absolutely.
This is Lindsay. So for the Biosketch, if a mentor or somebody on the grant sends you a Biosketch that, like you said, doesn't really reflect like your current project, is that something that it's acceptable for you to go in and change the first paragraph yourself, or is that something you contact them and ask them to change it, or is it?
I think what I would do is talk to them.
Okay.
Sometimes it's just a thing of busy, right? I mean, I think pretty much anybody who has ever requested a letter of support from somebody, it's not at all unusual for them to say, can you draft it for me? And then send it to me and I'll edit it and put it on letterhead. That's kind of a typical thing that, like if you ask a collaborator for a reagent or something, it's not at all unreasonable for them to ask you to draft it because you know what you want, they don't know. That what I would probably just say to the person is that, thank you so much for giving me your Biosketch. The first paragraph doesn't really tie in very well with my project though. So would you mind if I tried to edit it and send it to you for approval?
Okay.
And that would be a reasonable thing to do. Or maybe then they could come back and say, oh, I'm sorry, I'll just edit that real quick for you. Or yes, write that how you think you want and just send it to me to make sure you didn't incorporate anything wrong.
Okay.
It sort of depends on the relationship you have with the person, but most people would be relieved. But I wouldn't do it without touching base with them first.
Sure.
That kind of makes sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So do we have any kind of other questions about things at this moment? Okay. So that was good seeing everybody. I think next month we're going to be meeting for the um, sorry, go ahead. So did I just lose sound? Yeah, I'm bouncing myself for some reason. Okay. So the okay,